everyone, it's Sevi. Understanding what certain stats do is a huge help to informing our gameplay and build choices, and Honkai Star Rail is no exception to that. Some of Star Rail's stats are pretty obvious on what they do. HP, attack, defense, and crit stats are all universally understandable, and for the most part, players know how important they are for specific characters, like HP for abundance or crit for DPSs. But there are other stats that might not be as familiar for some of us, but can actually have a profound effect on the character you're using and building. That's why in this beginner's video, I want to give you a quick overview about these 4 stats: speed, break effect, effect hit rate, and energy regen rate, so that you can better understand what they do and how important they are. With that, let's get started. The first stat we have is speed, and it's not surprising why it's so important. If you're not that sure what speed does in Star Rail, it's very simple. As a turn-based game, Star Rail uses an action turn queue to determine the order your units and the enemies will move. A unit's speed is the most essential factor used to see how soon they can move relative to your teammates and the enemy's speed. And with enough speed, buffs, and debuffs, it's possible to move multiple times before an enemy can. Being able to act sooner and more often has so many benefits. You can deal more damage, you can activate abilities that set up your allies' damage or debuff enemies. You can generate more skill points, which helps with your skill point economy, and so on. It's not necessarily just DPS units that benefit from high speed, because even support units can largely benefit from speed as well. And in time-based challenges like the repeatable memory of chaos, speed will help you chase the cycle requirements for the highest star clears. So units that are able to manipulate the speed of allies or enemies can be very valuable. It ranges from units like Asta, who buffs the speed of your entire team and bumps them up the action queue, or Welt, who can imprison enemies, thereby reducing their speed and moving them further down the queue. Some units, especially those of the hunt path, love stacking speed to really dish out a lot of damage as fast as possible. For example, Dan Heng and Su Shang have their own abilities that let them increase their own speed, and they synergize well with speed buffing supports. Getting optimal speed in your relics will be a recurring goal for many builds. Feat relics are the only piece that can give speed as a main stat, but it's rollable as a substat. Some set bonuses also give a speed bonus or give an additional effect if you can reach a certain amount of speed stat, so the easiest way to do that is with feat pieces. But stacking speed on relic builds isn't necessarily the best route for some units either. For a unit like Zila, having more damage output from attack and crit substats can be more preferable, since her turn-refreshing playstyle relies on being able to deal the killing blow to enemies anyway, and she already innately has high speed and a speed buffing mechanic. If you also want to get slightly more technical about how speed affects the turn, there's an option to enable visibility on this thing called action value, and you'll see some numbers appear on the action queue. This number is the result of the in-game's mechanics for how it computes the different speed stats in relation to the characters in the queue, so you can see how they fluctuate as units keep moving and as you get speed-related buffs or debuffs. All in all, speed is going to be a generally important stat moving forward, and creating teams with optimal speed stats will be a key factor in optimizing rotations and beating hard content. Next is the break effect percent, and it's easy to misunderstand what it does. Let's recap first. Weakness breaks are additional damage and effects you can inflict on an enemy by breaking their toughness bar and the respective element they're weak to. This page summarizes what each element's break does and the additional effect it applies on the enemy. Some of them are about dealing damage over time, like burn for fire or bleed for physical, while some are for crowd control, like freeze for ice or imprison for imaginary. What's interesting about break damage is how it's calculated. If you're familiar with Genshin Impact's transformative reactions, it actually works very similarly to that. It doesn't use the usual attack, crit, and elemental damage boost stats that a character's abilities would normally scale from. Instead, the base damage first scales with a character's level. The higher the character's level, the higher the base damage of your break is. Different elements also have varying strength multipliers for the break damage, with physical and fire having the highest and imaginary having the lowest. There are other stats that also affect this on the enemy's end, like the defense and resistance reduction stats. And you can inflict debuffs to reduce such stats and make your break damage stronger. But for the most part, your character's level plays a huge part in calculating the break damage. So where does break effect percent come in? Well, basically, break effect percent directly multiplies the damage your weakness break does. For example, here we can see that Hook without any break-related bonuses does 241 damage. But if I equip the 2-piece set that adds 16% break effect, her break damage goes up to 280, a 16% increase. And if I add 32% break effect, the damage is now 318, a 32% increase from the original. It's not just the initial break damage though, as damage over time from weakness breaks like burn also gets affected by break effect. For something like Imaginary, which does not inflict damage over time, but rather inflicts Imprisoned, which slows down an enemy, break effect also plays a factor in how much the enemy is slowed. If this reminds you of the Elemental Mastery stat from Genshin, then you're right. It seems to be the closest parallel in Genshin with its mechanics, but of course we have to know the implications of when it can or can't be useful too. For one, break effect is only useful in as much a character can reliably break the enemy's toughness. You shouldn't go stacking boatloads of break effect on every character because not every character is meant to break often. But for characters who have better breaking capabilities, it does incentivize having break effect stats on them. A very good example is Asta. She's mainly a support that buffs your team's attack and speed, but what's amazing is her skill, which can hit up to 5 times or 6 with her E1. If you're up against a single target, her skill's hits are all dealt to that enemy, which can shred their toughness bar really quickly. So a very efficient way to make Asta deal unexpectedly higher damage despite being a support is to give her break effect stats. And while we're still not able to get relics to roll the coveted crit, attack, and elemental damage boost stats for our DPSs, many of our characters' raw damage is still far from their actual potential. Weakness breaking helps offset that in the meantime, and we get a lot of break effect set pieces to slap on supports and DPSs, so building break effect in the early game feels easy and busted. Of course, min-maxing stats to find the most super efficient combination of other offensive stats and break effect for certain characters may need more time to be definitively theory crafted or optimized. For now, the general player base is also still mostly in the early to mid-game content, so break effect feels busted. But I also have seen claims from those who reached far in the hardcore content during beta tests that break effect eventually starts falling off in the endgame, which I will have to see for myself. Either way, there's room for break effect to lose effectiveness or get better depending on the characters and content we get, which also sounds similar to how Elemental Mastery was like in Genshin. Up next is the effect hit rate stat. Some characters have abilities that can inflict effects or debuffs on enemies. Let's use March as our example. Her ultimate's description says it has a 50% base chance of freezing the enemy for 1 turn. While March can inflict frozen on ice weak enemies by breaking their toughness, March's ultimate has this separate innate freezing base chance. Adding effect hit rate to March will increase the chances of inflicting that freezing debuff with her ultimate, and this is applicable to other units with debuff chances on their abilities. Basically, the effect hit rate stat serves as a multiplier to the base chance. So let's say that I achieve a 50% hit rate stat on March, with her ultimate having only a 50% base chance. March now has a 75% chance of inflicting that freezing debuff with her ultimate. However, enemies can have their own effect resistance or debuff resistance, which decrease their chances of getting such effects inflicted on them. These are not easily visible in-game, so the values will likely be available in other online databases. Effect hit rate helps counteract their effect resistance as well. There are also some abilities or effects that have a fixed chance, like Danheng's bonus ability, which basically means it can't be modified, so effect hit rate isn't going to affect these. Anyway, under what circumstances would you want to use effect hit rate stats? Effect hit rate will be useful on characters whose ability effects are a significant part of their kit. March is one, as mentioned, to improve the chance of her ult freezing enemies. Another is Welt, whose skill has a 65% base chance of slowing enemies. Some effects also rely on the enemy having debuffs to trigger it, so increasing the chance of applying such debuffs can make such effects more reliable. But can you overcap on effect hit rate? Theoretically, yes, if the base chance is already very high and you add a lot of effect hit rate stat on them. There are abilities with 100% base chances of inflicting a debuff, like Pella's ultimate, but again, it's possible that the target has some effect or debuff resistance that would make the real chance less than 100%. So effect hit rate helps mitigate those resistances and makes application more reliable. Last but not least is Energy Regen Rate. In fact, it's actually one of the rarest stats you can get in relics since only the Link Rope gives it as a main stat, and one planar ornament too. It's not even available as a substat in any piece. Energy Regen Rate works very simply. Ultimates cost energy to cast, and characters gain energy through various methods like attacking, using abilities, getting hit, and so on. If actions give a fixed amount of base energy, Energy Regen Rate multiplies that. So if a basic attack gives 20 20 energy and you have 20% energy regen, then the total energy gained is 24. Regenerating energy is very important since doing so lets you cast or ready your ultimate sooner, which is a huge source for certain character support utilities or damage potential. For example, Japard's shield source is via his ultimate, and with battery energy regeneration, this makes it ready sooner, making his defensive utility more reliable and consistent. For a buffer like Tingyun, having her ultimate ready sooner means that she can recharge her teammates' energies faster and buff them as well. And that can also synergize further with using certain equipment that rely on using your ultimate. For Tingyun's example, if you use the Dance 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 light cones, which advance forward your team's actions when the wearer uses their ultimate, then being able to spam Tingyun's ultimate more makes for faster turn rates. However, this doesn't necessarily mean that every character should prioritize energy regen rate for their link rope. Because if your character's default energy regen rate is already sufficient, or maybe the buffs and extra sources of energy they receive becomes excessive, then that's a main stat piece that could have gone to another optimal stat. Again, this is a case-to-case basis, so as we learn more about building, then we can probably get more definitive answers of each character's energy preferences. And that's the rundown on these 4 stats. There are some deeper nuances and intricacies to some of these mechanics, but to avoid making this feel like that college class you just want to get over with, I'll keep this video relatively simple. Hopefully, this helped you learn a thing or two about these stats and when to consider them. As we progress more throughout the game, I hope to also delve deeper in these topics, especially to help you build your characters the best they can be. Let me know in the comments if you have characters that you found make great use of any of these stats. If this video helped you out, don't forget to leave a like, consider subscribing to my channel if you haven't already, and I will see you all soon. Take care!